Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to Making Sense of Modern Times. This is The Conversation. Those of you who've been following this journey know that I created this space so that I could have a conversation on topics that I believe kind of help us make sense of the modern human experience. I'm super interested in a lot of tensions that we face in modern life. Things like we have unlimited information, but we have shrinking attention spans. We can speak to people in any part of the world, but we no longer know our neighbors. We have, what else? Artificial intelligence and human intolerance. I think all these things are super interesting, and I like to think about them and take a step back and think about them because I think they help us navigate life. And I wanted a place to have these conversations with people who I think are championing new ideas, interesting ideas, and really important ideas, basically to help us with the modern human experience. And so when I was thinking, okay, who do I want to invite as the next guest to have a conversation, selfishly for me and hopefully of value to all of you, I thought of Mimi. Mimi and I share a few things in that we both have a background in an advertising industry at some stage and have now gone on to pursue, I suppose, purpose in some way or another. And before we have a conversation, I wanted to give you a little bit of background to Mimi. So Mimi has founded, she's the founder of Empathy Everywhere, and she is a leading empathy advocate. I'm sure she'll tell us about that for companies and for communities worldwide. And really her foundational belief, which really connected me, which I felt connected to, was this idea that she believes in a more connected world, and really, from the looks of it, is on her way to creating it. So I don't want to go too much more because I want this to be a conversation between two people, really talking about this idea. So I want to welcome Mimi and say it's so cool to have you in this space, and thank you for taking time out of your worldwide schedule to chat to me.
No, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure because I love to talk about this, and we'll talk about that later, but I believe that each conversation is part of my mission, but also because for him, we have a long history, and anytime somebody reaches out where, you think, gosh, we knew each other in another world, and now there's shared passion in this world, I think it makes for a great conversation. So yeah, I'm really happy. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much. So I know we have a limited time together, and I'm sure we're going to dive into kind of the world of empathy. But before we get there, maybe for those who aren't familiar with your work and your story, what is the story of Mimi that led to this journey that finds us here, where you are now leading this, I would say, global movement around empathy? What led to this moment, if someone doesn't know you?
Yeah, what led to this moment? First of all, it's always amazing to me when people say things like, global movement. And earlier you said, she's the founder of, and I'm like, am I the founder of something, because it has been a really intuitive journey, actually. And I'm sure we can talk today a little bit about this sort of big P word, which is purpose, and everybody's looking for it. And have you found it? And do you have it? But I now believe, Fahim, truly, and I'm not just saying it, because it sounds good, that this was my purpose and it found me. I was definitely not looking for it. As you mentioned, I was in advertising for my whole career. My father was an ad man. I loved advertising. I still do, work in and out of it. Great industry, love creativity, all of those wonderful things. Met phenomenal humans, and many of whom have come with me for such a long way, right, on this journey and the last one. So I was always very passionate about my corporate career, but it was probably in 2018 I moved to Dubai. I was in South Africa before that, where we met. Also a huge love affair with South Africa, still spend a lot of my time there. But I moved to Dubai for a big corporate American ad land role. And let's just say that when I got there, it wasn't quite as they had explained it to be on paper, which I found out, years later is not that uncommon in some of these roles. But long story short, I was entirely unprepared for that role. I had been in very corporate roles until then. There was always plenty of people around me, plenty of support, plenty of friends, 15 people in procurement, finance, legal, there's just support everywhere. And I ended up in a role, a CEO, a regional role, where there was nobody other than me, basically, and a team that was, let's just say, not doing as well as I had perhaps been led to believe before arriving. And it was very, very difficult. As I said, I was totally overwhelmed. I was totally underprepared. I became an entrepreneur overnight, and I never wanted to be an entrepreneur. I still don't want to be an entrepreneur now. Apparently, but it's still, was not really my plan. But something phenomenal happened, because in that process, I met with a business coach, which I had never done before. And I met her for lunch, and I was telling her about this, I don't know, dichotomy, this drama in front of me. And she asked me about my leadership style. And she asked me one question, which fundamentally changed my life. And when I was talking to her, I was talking about intuition. And I said I had always been a very intuitive leader.
Yeah.
And she stopped me and she asked this one big question. And she said to me, Mimi, is it intuition or is it empathy? And at the time, I remember thinking, what's empathy got to do with anything, right? But long story short, I left that lunch meeting and I started to research empathy. I discovered something called the empathy deficit, which is the lack of connectivity in our world. You touched on some of those problems that humanity's facing at the beginning.
Yeah.
And for him, I couldn't turn back from that. Once I had discovered the size of this problem, I couldn't believe that nobody was talking about it. And it wasn't like I decided, hey, I'm going to become an advocate for this. I'm going to leave the corporate world. None of that. There was no big explosion moment. It was just a recognition that this information that I had uncovered, this reality, felt like it needed fixing. And I felt that probably I could do something to help fix it. And that's how it started in around 2018.
I love it. It makes me think of a question that I'm asked quite often by people who are maybe still on, the corporate kind of ladder, and they go, how do you know when you're ready to kind of jump off and become an entrepreneur? What tells you? And I was like, you know what? If you're waiting for the magic rubric or the moment or permission, you'll be waiting forever. You just need enough of a pull to, at some moment, just jump. So I completely connect with what you're saying. And for me, I had a similar experience, which is I wasn't pushed out of an industry. I was pulled by the kind of gravity of something else. And I think that push and pull dynamic is often what people considering big changes are faced with. And I suppose what we're both saying to you guys, if anyone is facing that moment, is feel the pull and let it take you where it needs to. So, okay, I get it. So now you've discovered this beautiful world of empathy, and I think it's a word we hear. It's a word that certainly for me, when I was in leadership positions, you hear, we have the right coaches talk about it, and you hear about it in leadership styles. But what is it? Simply put, what is empathy, and why is it important? Not just at work, but perhaps in all our relationships.
So what is it? It is fundamentally perspective taking. That's it. Right? That's as complicated as it gets. You could, and of course I do very long hours of masterclasses on this. But fundamentally, Fahim, that's what it is. We're talking about being able to understand the world from somebody else's perspective. Why do they see something slightly different in the same reality that you're looking at? Why are they experiencing the workplace or a job or a relationship or a scenario differently from you? How do they see it? What's their experience of it? So it's just perspective taking. It is something we're born with. It is built into the prefrontal cortex of your brain. So one of the questions I get asked most is, but Mimi, do you just have more empathy than everyone else? And the answer is no. The vast majority, like over 99% of the population of the world, are born with this built into their brain. It is a skill that you choose to use. So you can take the perspective of others, but it's up to you whether you do that or not. So that's what it is in its most simple form. And why is it important? Because it is a pro-social skill set. So we have empathy in our brains because we need it to survive, not to thrive. You will thrive if you use it more, but quite literally to survive. It is a skill that the human race has used since we existed, because we're a pro-social species, because we need to collaborate and communicate and work together, because being seen and heard is fundamental to our survival, to us being able to fight disease, for our sense of purpose, our sense of identity, our sense of confidence. It is fundamental to who we are as human beings, and we don't have enough of it. So, why we need it is because we need to fill all the gaps. When empathy is low, there are just huge gaps all around us. We have disconnection. And I would say that today we're seeing disconnection at scale.
Yeah, I'd completely agree with that. And I think, you know, on so many levels. And so my question, I suppose, then is, if we're born with it and it's perhaps something that's natural to us, what happens to lead to a world that is, you know, perhaps lacking in empathy in parts? How do we get from being born with something that's natural, that's, you know, part of our evolutionary mechanics? What intercepts?
Well, first of all, for him, I'm going to be really bold and say it's not like a perhaps, it might be in small portions. It definitely is, right?
Yeah.
We have 40 years of declining empathy. We have lost 48% of it over those 3 decades. And when empathy is low, you will see segregation rise. So I often tell my audiences that when empathy goes down, the isms go up, whether that's racism, ageism, sexism, whatever ism there are, right? So people come apart. Why is a far more complicated answer. There are many reasons. Urbanization is one of them. And again, each of these you could talk about for a very long time, but fundamentally we have moved away from our homelands, both figuratively and literally, in terms of our identity and our connection to who we are, to our cultures, to our communities, to our families. Urbanization is one of them. The digital era, and I'm very clear to say the digital world, social media can be a great source of empathy and connection. So I'm not at all sort of, you know, pushing it away, but we do know that, you know, we have many millions of people who spend far more time alone with technology than they do connected to other human beings. Fear. When we have fear at large, at scale, which we have and do in the world, you will see people return to like, and that means that they're not practicing the skill set. And like any skill set, like, I don't know, riding a bike or playing golf, right? The more you do it, the better you get at it. Generational gaps, speed of technology, crime, many reasons that impact the human psyche and just reduce our capacity to understand others. Fundamentally, empathy has 2 great enemies. One is low time and the other is high stress. And if we asked your audience to put their hands up in there, wherever they're listening today, do you have low time and high stress? I would say like 90% will say yes. So, you know, the less time, the higher the stress our lives sort of support us with, the harder it is to use that skill set to connect with others, because we're fundamentally in that kind of survival mechanism, which is ironic, given the survival actually comes back to connection, but we don't always get that right.
Oh, that's such a powerful point. I don't know. I feel like we're entering this period where we've extended ourselves perhaps a bit further than we were evolutionary ready for as a species. And I do put technology in the camp of being responsible, partly because I think the technology industry, which I am now joining, is obsessed with what could we do, not what should we do. So it's a fundamental like journey of just expansion for all, you know, every and each way, versus what actually is the right thing to do right now. What do we need? You know, we're trying to get to Mars, and the smartest people on Earth are working on that when we have enough things to solve, like right here. So I'm always fascinated by this, but kind of moving in a new direction. Often we hear, and I'm going to go here, I'd love to hear your view on this. We often hear that women are more empathetic than men when it comes to leadership and styles. And when one looks at the last generation of leaders, I am generalizing, but there's, you know, the famous theme of, you know, the wartime created certain general type, corporate type leaders, which did lead to huge performance and massive companies all over the world. But I want to get into this because my instinct is it's misdirected or slightly misunderstood. So number one, is there a gender skew at all on this topic? And let's maybe start with that, and then I want to get into the growth of companies that have perhaps been led by people who'd be seen as not being empathetic. How do we make sense of those? Where do they fit in this world?
So, yeah, fascinating topic. The first answer is no. Scientifically, there is no sort of gender bias in empathy. There's no genetic DNA hormonal shift, right, that makes women more empathetic than men. In fact, I never quote, I actually can't even think of a female leader that I quote in terms of empathy. They're all men. So there are plenty of male empathetic leaders who are really leading the way. For example, Satya Nadella, who's one of my favorites, who's the CEO chairman of Microsoft, right? So there's no gender bias. Having said that, women do tend, again, stereotype, generalization, to be naturally more empathetic than men. There's a couple of theories around that. One of them is that from a generational context point of view, we have just learned that over time. So when we had multi-generational homes, multi-family buildings that we were living in, the women of the house, particularly when they were caregivers, had to listen and empathize with many people, right? They had like 5, 6, 7 children in the home. They had elderly. They had at least one husband in the home, brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles. And those women had to empathize a lot. Who wants to eat? When do they want to eat? Who needs to sleep? Who needs to wash? All of these things, right? So there is a theory around that generational context that as women, we have handed down that skill set more naturally than men. Men, as you touched on, from that kind of war, turn of the century, industrial revolution mentality, they did move into, they became machines, right? Which is ironic because you were talking about technology, kind of machines taking over the world, but that very kind of industrial revolution mindset of production, growth, right? They got on that train. So there's also an argument that the men just sort of got out of practice. As we said earlier, this is a skill set. It wasn't a skill set they needed. So in their defense, at large, for men, they didn't need to be empathizing with people because their jobs weren't there. The level of complexity in their worlds was nowhere near where it is today. And of course, the complexity in our worlds today has sped up in such a short period. I often say, Fahim, I feel quite sorry for leaders today because it's just so complicated, but we can come back to that. So there's an argument that men kind of got out the habit of just not needing to use that skill set. And then there is also proof that women can genetically multitask better than men. Their brains do work in a way where women can handle multiple tasks with more likely success than men, to quote the data. And that would mean that they find it more, they have higher capacity to perhaps do a more functional task and understand their context. In parallel, it's not a huge difference, to be honest, but they can do it better. Although, again, according to neuroscience, actually, nobody can apparently multitask. Apparently, it doesn't really exist. We can actually only do one.
Well, that's music to my ears, thankfully.
But let's see. So yes, no, but the answer is no. Genetically, and for any guys listening, and I often have leaders at the end of my workshops or masterclasses, whatever, say, Mimi, I think I'm a really bad listener. I'm like, that's okay, right? Like, you recognize it. This is a skill set. So men tend to be slightly less good at it, but there's no reason that we can't all be as good as each other. Yeah,
love it. 2 words that often live side by side, but I think are fundamentally different, is empathy and sympathy. Do you often get asked about that, and what do you see as the difference?
Yeah, like every week.
Every day.
It's a very big difference, actually. So empathy is a skill set and sympathy is an emotion, right? Or it's an emotion and it can lead to action, which would be compassion, actually. So if you want to add a third word to the mix. Empathy is a skill set because it's a fundamental understanding and it brings you closer together, whether you're colleagues, family members, people negotiating a deal. Empathy, because it's insight, it's data. I understand you. You are getting closer together in opinion, in solution, in conflict management, whatever it is, you are coming closer together. Sympathy is an emotion, a nice emotion, but it is the same thing as pity. It creates distance because I can say, Fahim, I heard some bad news. I'm very sorry for you.
Yeah.
Right, but I'm away from you. It's like sending flowers to somebody who's been sick. You're not getting any closer to them. You're just showing them a sign. I'm thinking of you. That's why I say it's a good thing. It's not a bad thing, but it is an emotion. Whereas empathy is actually a skill set and therefore has a fundamental place in things like decision-making, negotiation, leadership, that type of thing.
Yeah. And then how does that interplay with vulnerability? Because often what I find is, certainly if I cast my mind back to when I was leading a company, most meetings are about trying to gain perspective. When you're in leadership, you're trying to see things from one person's perspective, a group's perspective, a client's perspective, etc., supplier's perspective. And And that's often an interplay with your own biases, your own points of view, your own beliefs. And in order to allow yourself, I believe, to fully be empathetic, you've got to be brave enough to be vulnerable, to allow yourself to kind of pull your walls down and be wrong in the right context and be open to other ways of seeing things. So is vulnerability a necessary skill, an emotion or behavior in order to become a more empathetic person?
No, I don't think so. I think it could be. So perhaps, for example, for you, in your experiences, you were just explaining it then, and you were thinking, for me, as Fahim, I might need to open myself to a bit of vulnerability to be able to hear that point of view. So it could be a personal reality for many. But no, I mean, empathy as a data set, some of the organizations that use it most successfully are organizations like the Army or the FBI. There's no place for vulnerability if you're negotiating with a hostage taker at a bank with an AK-47. So I think the other thing with vulnerability is, of course, it's taken kind of viral credibility in recent years. But I think it's an incredibly scary word for women and men, but particularly men, but both sexes, right? Nobody wants to be vulnerable because we associate vulnerability with danger, with fear, with opening ourselves up to potential risk. And that therefore impacts how we process things in our brain, our ability to consciously think. So first of all, I don't think it has anything to do with vulnerability. Empathy as a data set is judgmentless, right? So the key thing is to know that to empathize is not to judge or to agree. So what I fully agree with what you were saying, Fahim, is that to take other people's points of views, you have to be open and say, I don't agree with what he's saying, but I understand why he's saying it, or I understand that for him this matters. But that's not being vulnerable. That's just being open. That's being open. That's being clear. That's leaning into a conversation and trying to find a resolution. But no, I don't think it's. I don't think it's. Does that make sense to you? Does that feel kind of make sense?
No, it does. And I think especially your example using the FBI or whatever, it starts to shift empathy for me from just a soft skill into a hard skill. And I wondered what your view on that is. I see it now, having heard you, as something that's data driven, that actually drives performance beyond just kind of the obvious benefits. When you're talking to companies, what is attracting them to this idea? What are they seeing in their worlds that connects so powerfully? Because obviously we'll get onto what you're up to now and all the speaking that you do, but you're obviously hitting a nerve somewhere. What is that nerve with companies and with leaders and with audiences that's connecting here?
Yeah, look, I think it's quite a recent nerve as well. So you're right, it's not a soft skill. It's a hard skill. It's hard to find, it's hard to maintain, and it does, as you say, have hard business results. So when I look at the clients that are asking for me to work with them or to collaborate in some way, some of them it's about performance. Fundamentally, we want our staff to perform better. Often it's around attrition. So we do have a huge attrition crisis everywhere. Like every sector says it to me, like it's unique to accounting or law or healthcare or whatever. And I always actually take pleasure in saying, don't worry, you're not alone, right? It's everywhere. So it might be around attrition. Occasionally, it might be around well-being. So I do work sometimes in organizations who have well-being commitments or agendas that they want to push. And of course, emotional well-being, belonging, being able to communicate is fundamental to being well. Diversity and inclusion is a big theme in the world in the general. And again, I always say to people, how can you ever include someone if you don't understand them? You know, people always want to be more inclusive of women, but are you asking those women how they want to be included and what types of roles and what types of ways? So for him, it comes from many places, but I think it's only now, I've been doing this for 5 years, I think it's only now just tipping. And again, we could talk about the power of social media for hours, but social media has been very powerful for me. It's very helpful. I found you again there, I find everybody there. But at the same time, I think social media often makes things look like they're further ahead than they are. And honest truth is right now, well, first of all, my social media is like 100% authentic, so you can see it because I'm on a plane like every minute. But just in the last 3 months, I can feel a shift, after 5 years of waking up every day, Sunday, Christmas Day, every day to talk about this. Now I think I'm not alone. Now I think there's fever pitch actually around this, and I think 2025 will see that expand. Workplaces, first time in history we have 4 generations in the workplace. People don't know how to handle it. The old don't know how to talk to the young, vice versa. And yeah, we're just very lonely. So unfortunately we have a huge loneliness epidemic. 52% of us are lonely, and the lonelier people are, whether that's in work, in leadership, in life, the more they need to be understood, right? The more they need to be reconnected. So it's a mix of social factors which I think are really impacting how and why we work, and that's changing things quite quickly, I think.
Yeah, I love it. I'm kind of just going with what I'm feeling in the conversation, and I think there's an obvious connection between the workplace and the need for more empathy. What if we step outside the workplace and we just go into modern human dynamics? Something that I'm writing about at the moment is the lack of community in the world. You've spoken a lot about it actually already in terms of the shift in households and urbanization. But when we look, for example, at young men today, there's lots of studies that have come out now are, less social, are hanging out with their friends less, are meeting less partners, etc. Does empathy have a role to play kind of in this dynamic? Or when we step into, maybe let's talk relationships, actually, friendships, family relationships, how does empathy play a role here? Because you have some additional things to think about here, like cultural factors, economic factors that change power dynamics, etc. So have you thought about that when it comes to empathy, and how do we think about it in our personal lives?
Well, I'm super excited that you asked me this question, because you are the first person to ask me, and my next book, my third book, is about this. So
awesome.
And you didn't even know. So yes, I mean, it plays a huge impact. What you're touching on there, whether it's young men or in fact basically any other demographic, is this loneliness epidemic, which is resulting in far more levels of isolation, lack of community, lack of connection, which ultimately leads to disease, to chronic illness, to suicide, to all kinds of bad things. But at the very sort of, I guess, entry level end of that, it relates to lack of relationships or poor relationships and low performance in life, whether that's at work or it's in your family or it's in communications, because everyone needs to be seen and heard. So back to empathy. When 2 babies are born, if they are born equally sick, the one that gets more levels or more amounts of empathy will outlive the other. So fundamentally, our mortality is directly impacted by the levels of empathy. So I have a chapter in my book, my new book, actually, and the subtitle of that chapter is "How Many Marriages Could We Save?" Because can you imagine how many broken relationships, moments of conflict, whether that is a marriage between mother and child, step parents, mother-in-law, which I'm sure is like super relevant to so many people. And it does have a huge impact when it comes to culture as well. How many of those relationships could we solve if we were just a bit more understanding, if we were able to hear each other? And I often play a film clip to bring this to life. It's actually on my LinkedIn because I put it up there just like last week. It's called, for anyone listening, go and Google it or put it into YouTube. It's called "It's Not About the Nail." And this little clip, it's like a minute and a half, is a brilliant example, Fahim, of how empathy is needed in relationships. Empathy is fundamentally listening. And what you see in this clip is this couple, and they are having an argument about a nail. I won't give it away, but there is a nail that's featured in the story. And the husband has very good intentions, and he's trying to help his wife by giving her solutions. And she keeps saying to him, "You are not listening to me." And he's saying, no. I don't think you need me to listen. I think you need to fix this thing that I can see is causing me a problem. And she's getting more and more upset because all she wants is to be heard. She doesn't want him to fix it. Yeah. She just wants him to hear her. So it's a great explanation, a really fun clip. It will make you laugh. But whether that's, as I said, whether it's a married couple, it's between parents and their children, or parents and their in-laws, siblings, anywhere that you have a relationship, you have to start with listening.
Yeah.
And when we talk about empathy, that's fundamentally what we're talking about.
Yeah, love it. So where do we start? I'm listening, I'm going, you've sold me, I need more of this in my life, I need more of it at work, I need more of it in my relationships, I need more of it with myself, which I'm sure is a whole different topic, maybe fourth book. Where do I start?
So you start by having this conversation, which is fantastic. It starts with intention. As I said earlier, this is something that you have the capacity to do. It is built into your brain. The thing with listening, let's just focus on that, because that is fundamentally the way into empathy, is that whilst we can do it, we don't practice it very often. So when children are small, like maybe under 5, we are constantly reminding them of this, right? You're constantly saying, listen to mummy, listen to auntie, listen to daddy, listen to teacher. We're reminding them for like 5 years solid how to listen. What did I say? Did you hear me say that? All of these things. Then we go to school and university and we start working, and we stop teaching anybody. We stop teaching it, we stop practicing it, and we get very confused about the difference between hearing something and listening to something, right? So hearing is, if you don't have any physiological problems, hearing is a natural occurring reality. It's passive. If I drop a glass now, you'll hear it, right? Listening is an active skill set. You have to be intentional about listening. And to bring that to life in an example, you might think of a time where you were in a meeting and someone's talking to you, and the other person in the room is saying, I spoke to the CEO, we're going to have to change the timelines, we're going to need to move the production deadlines. You are hearing this information, and in your head, you're thinking, but I'm going to have to tell Fahim, there's no way, we're never going to be able to make that, and the production timings cannot move, and I'm going to have to call the supplier, and all these things are going around in your head, right? You are hearing the other person, but you are no longer listening to them, because actually you're listening to yourself, because we can only hear one voice in our brain at once, and you're hearing your own. So it would be the same with a mother and child. To take it into the personal environment, you might be driving the car, the kid's coming home from school, she's telling you about something terribly mundane, about what happened in the playground. You're driving, you're but actually you're thinking, I've got to get to the supermarket, I don't want to get there after dark, will the petrol station be over, did I buy enough dog food? You're not listening, right, to your child anymore. So we do this all the time. It's a natural occurring reality. And when I talk about this on stage, like, just the people across the audience are like smiling and nodding, right? You did it too. So the first thing to do is to bring intentional awareness to this and ask yourself this one great question, which is, am I listening to understand, or am I listening to reply? And if you just do that, I mean, there's many other things we can go through for him, but if you just do that, you will make a massive difference to your relationships, particularly with your kids, your romantic relationships and your workplace. Just really listening. And in doing that, you know, some of the things that come with listening, like make eye contact, show interest, slightly leaning forwards, open body language. We can talk about them if you want, but all the things that come with listening and showing listening. And then miraculous things happen. It's almost instant. That's a great thing. You can start tonight and you'll see the impact tonight. You don't even have to wait till tomorrow.
I love it. So yeah, I feel like we've really got into this topic. If anyone wants to connect more on what Mimi's doing in the space of empathy, please do follow her on LinkedIn and all her platforms. That's where I keep up to date with her. I'm sure you do lots of conversations around this topic, but I wonder how many you do about things that aren't empathy related, but I think will really connect with people. For example, you're doing what seems like, you know, the global speaking circuit. Every time I kind of follow you doing, you're on a different flight, etc. How are you doing with that? It must be a new journey. It must come with its challenges. You spoke earlier about you still don't want to be an entrepreneur, even though you are clearly a phenomenal one. How's that going? How is this whirlwind global life going for you? How are you coping with it?
Oh, look, it's funny, again, talk about tipping points and things changing. You would have been right if we spoke probably even in August, and now for those of you listening in the future, this is now 1st of November that we're speaking. So just a few months ago, nobody was asking me these questions. But again, in the last like 3-4 months, suddenly everybody's asking me these questions, because I think, as you said, you can feel what I'm experiencing via social, which is that suddenly this is exploding. So how am I coping with it? I absolutely love it. The entrepreneur thing is an interesting thing, because I really don't, as I said earlier, I don't feel like an entrepreneur. Do I feel like, I guess, a thought leader is probably my favorite word, because I hate the word influencer. So every time someone says you're an influencer, I'm like, we cannot be friends until you say I'm joking. But this kind of thought leadership, which is, or even content creator, right? Because that's fundamentally what I'm doing traveling the world, is creating content, whether that's new books, keynotes, workshops, social content, videos, whatever it is, different forms of content that explain what empathy is to the world. In that identity, I'm extremely content, and I love it every day. I absolutely love it. The travel is wonderful, because I'm traveling on my own terms. It's not, as you said, without its challenges. I have a little girl. She's just turned 7. I have, pets and boyfriends and, all these things that need personal care in my life. So it's a balance for sure. And some months, like November, I have, I think, 6 countries this month. So it's a lot. But as I said, the great thing is I'm doing it on my own terms. So I get to choose where I travel and what I travel for, and whether I want to charge or not charge, or charge a lot or charge a little, or stay for a day or stay for a week. So I'm a great believer, Fahim, that momentum leads to momentum. And for anyone that's looking to do like a similar journey or make these types of transitions, I would just say keep leaning in, because it doesn't happen overnight either, right? It's been 5 years to get to this point. And I'm loving it is the short answer. That's very McDonald's, isn't it? I'm loving it, but I really am.
No, it's so good to hear. And you can feel your energy towards it, because it's kind of infectious, not just in this format, but in what you share. And something I've been wondering and wanted to ask you is how you're seeing the differences between markets, because something that I found in the last year, I've been doing some masterclasses and a few different consulting gigs in different parts of the world too. And I'm always fascinated not by the things that are different, but by the foundational things that connect everyone. Because I think trends change and new technologies change, but what makes us human and our foundations don't change. Jeff Bezos said, build a business around the things that hold true in time, because that's when you can build something that is substantial and forever, true. And what are you finding when you're talking about empathy? I know you're doing a lot in Asia and the Middle East and elsewhere. What are the differences and the nuances per region, the big ones, and what's just common ground between people?
So it's a brilliant question. I always say to my audiences that we are all more alike than we are different.
Yeah.
And I say that because I mean it. And exactly to your point. And again, this is absolutely not a promotion for my new book, but I literally just finished it last week. So I'm like full of editorial joy. It's a big theme in that book, which is that fundamentally the things we need are completely cross-cultural and also cross-generational. We find so much of our time trying to find solutions for things. I know your new health startup is in, a niche that you see growing in health, right? We spend a lot of time focusing on how to fix things that are modern day realities. But what I've learned across all that travel is the things that make us better are exactly the same everywhere. Yeah. And they are the fundamentals of life, relationship, movement, diet, sleep, connection, self-confidence. It doesn't matter what language you speak, what level you are, whether you live in a city or a grassland somewhere. I think, it sounds very romantic, but it's true. When you go back to the evolution of the human race, the things that we needed then, we need now. We've just got better at delivering them, and we do it faster and more efficiently than ever before. In terms of the differences, look, they're vast because of culture. And I think culture gets underplayed because it's complicated and because the media rhetoric is led by the West. And after the West being, massive generalization for basically the US, Australia, Europe, and the UK. The second messaging structure under that is the East, which tends to be East Asia, East and South Asia. And then anybody else that's not in those two is completely misunderstood, right? So if you want to understand Kenyan culture, nobody's teaching you today, right? So culture makes such a huge difference in terms of how we connect, in how we show empathy. So for example, I teach a lot of eye contact, but in China, that's not going to be something you're going to do. So that's a very tiny thing. But I have South Asian family members. So I'm part of a South Asian family. And as a non-South Asian, I have to learn a lot, right, about how you engage in those groups and those relationships and what empathy, but even if you're not talking about empathy, respect, politeness. As a woman, what do I do? What don't I do? I mean, there's things that I do within my Asian family that Western families stopped doing a long time ago or never did. So, culture plays a huge part in the things that pull us apart. And that can be really beautiful because, I mean, imagine travel if everybody was the same, right? You would never get that experience of travel. So culture is beautiful, but it's also beautifully complex. And I think nearly everything that makes us distinct is connected to either culture or personal identity. But underpinning all of those things, the things that make us the same, the need to be loved, the need to belong, the need to be inspired, there are far more of those things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, part of what we're building with our health tech startup, which is called True Nature, is really connecting people to the foundational pillars of health that you've actually just spoken about, the 5 key ones. And one of them is social connection, and not just it's connection to self and connection to others. And that, I think, is really where empathy plays such a big role. So I really want to thank you for championing such an important topic. I think the world is basically a better place because you're leading by example, and you're not just sharing your ideas through books, but you're teaching. Will you tell us a little bit more about what your kind of world looks like? Obviously, you do speaking and masterclasses, you write books. What's the kind of variety of things you do, and how can people get involved?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I like to create content, whatever format that is. So I guess the key pillars of what is now my business, but started as a passion, is in speaking and in masterclasses and in executive dinners. And fundamentally, the premise for all of those is around connectivity that can take the form of communication, psychological safety, diversity and inclusion. But they're different ways into the same reality. The point here is, how do we understand each other better, regardless of age, culture, location, all of those things. I create a huge amount of social content, which you can find on Instagram, which is at Mimi Nicklin, and on LinkedIn, which is also Mimi Nicklin, and my YouTube as well. So pretty much, if you just Google my name and the word empathy, you'll probably have, I don't know how many Google entries, but a lot, because I spend a lot of time in the media as well. I recently met with the BBC, and that was relatively intimidating, but quite fun. And Forbes and Harvard Business Review. And pretty much, Fahim, I try and speak or write anywhere that there is an audience, because I believe that the more the world talks about empathy, the more empathy the world will have. And as you said in your new business, there's never been a time when we need that connection more than now.
100%. So maybe just to kind of wrap, if you could, let's fast forward ourselves 10 years.
Yep.
I've got a bit more gray in my beard, and you've written another 50 books. If you could wave a magic wand in 10 years' time and change something in the world, or shift something, what would it be?
Oh, I know exactly what it'd be. I would like to wave a wand and reduce loneliness. Not only because as a social sphere, it's critical to our health and our survival, and I believe significantly impactful to our health. So what you're doing is critical, and thank you for what you're doing. And from what I understand, the area of health that you're in is growing because of these exact reasons.
Exactly.
So I would do that because for us as human beings, it would be good for our health. I would do it because the future of work cannot be like today's environment. We cannot have, so at the moment, in a recent survey, 54%, this is mind-boggling, 54% of CEOs stated that they believe their companies are toxic. And they are the CEOs of those companies. Right? So this is not sustainable, right? For performance, for growth, for GDP, for any of the things that matter in terms of, survival of the economy. But thirdly, and probably mainly, because we have a huge suicide crisis on our hands, and it can't continue. The second biggest killer of our youth is no longer vehicle accidents, but suicide. You spoke earlier about young men. The increase in male suicide all over the planet is through the roof. We have created this wonderful world full of advancements, and we can solve diseases and get places faster and practically teleport ourselves. But we're so lonely that we choose to leave the world rather than stay on it. So if I can make even 0.05% impact on loneliness by giving people skills to reconnect and, finding the confidence to have a conversation, to listen to people better, then yeah, maybe 0.5 is quite a high number, but some small percentage, I would love to see that happen in the world.
Amazing. I'd back you to do just that. So Mimi, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. I think it's incredibly powerful.
Thank you.
I think, I don't know if you've read Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act.
No, but
if not, I'm going to send you a copy. And he speaks about this idea that an idea whose time has come will find its way to express itself in the world. Often it will, it feels like, empathy chose you at this time. And there's two reasons. One is the person was ready to deliver that idea. And the second is that the idea was needed and that it needed to come into the world to do something. It had a role that it needed to play. And I think the journey that you're on is kind of proving that. So I just wish you lots of success. I think that it's amazing what you're doing. I think it's exciting. I can feel the momentum just as much as you can. So just wishing you and your team lots of success. And yeah, if there's any way we can support, you just let us know.
Oh, well, thank you. And that quote, I hadn't heard it, but I love it. So I will put it on the wall. But thank you. Thank you for hosting the conversation. As I said earlier, everyone is a little ripple in that conversation forward. So, and I'm so happy to hear that your business is also valuing connectivity and what it can do for our health. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Mimi.